a stroll around the houses. We're going to talk about houses today because they are not really measured in classical economics in a way which makes any sense, and therefore we're going to put them within a quantum economic perspective. First of all, let's say I have a house and I make 1,000% gain on it. That doesn't enter into economic statistics. It's not part of GDP. I get my house with 1,000% gain and I sell it to you. You get the house and I get your money. But that is just a transfer. It doesn't influence GDP, it doesn't influence output. Now, let us think for a minute about the work that needs to be done in that house. If I hire somebody legally to come and help me keep the house clean, that goes into GDP, goes into national income. But if I clean the house myself, or if my partner cleans the house, then that is not counted at all. Oddly enough, if you go back to the good old days of the USSR, in East Germany, cleaning the house was a part of GDP. If you had a partner or yourself who stayed at home and cleaned the house, that was a part of national output. Quite justifiably so, which goes to show they didn't get everything wrong. Now let us think for a second and suppose in a completely immoral moment, I turn my house into a brothel. In most countries, that would clearly be an economic activity. It would certainly result in medical bills, which would enter into GDP, but unless the activity of running a brothel was actually legal, it would not enter into GDP. It would enter into and be counted in what is called the shadow economy. Now, if, however, I start making, let's say, tapestries in my house, and that's a business, and let's say it's a partnership or something like that, then it enters into GDP. As the tapestries come out the door, GDP goes up and the house becomes a productive asset. But we all know that's a very silly way of looking at an asset. It's productive, it's not productive, it's part of GDP. What it does is part of GDP. Looking out what it is not part of GDP. It either is or it's not. Now, I would make the case that the houses are very, very important to GDP. They're the single biggest asset class in individuals' and households' balance sheets, and they influence economic behavior enormously. Let us take, for example, that you have a nice house and you're happy there. You've even probably just expanded it so that you can do more work there than in the office. As you get happier, you will become more productive. Now, maybe you were very productive in the office because you had investment bankers of a more senior standing looking over your shoulder and making you afraid of losing your job, the kind of Darwinian economics which they all want to return to. But on the other hand, maybe because you're at home and you're contented and your home is nice, maybe you actually become more productive, which of course will influence GDP, but it will be nothing to do in GDP with the house, which will not be counted as a productive asset. But it is quite clear to everybody that if you are homeless, you are much more likely to be productive than if you have a nice home. So actually, houses are an extremely part of production. They're an extremely big part of people's balance sheets. Now I want to go on to the second chapter. The second chapter is all about what happened to housing in the pandemic. And the answer is worldwide, globally, house prices went through the roof. Now that is very, very counterintuitive. Here we were in a pandemic, probably the worst thing that we've seen since the plague, with the world economy teetering on the brink of collapse, and house prices zoom into the heavens. What on earth is that about? Well, we have to understand that because it is very key to what is going to happen to the world economy from here. What happened was very clear. Central banks and governments, who are now one and the same thing, locked in embrace, rather than independent of each other as they used to be, they pushed the cost of capital down below zero in real and very often in nominal terms. Indeed, in kindly societies like Denmark, you got paid to take out a mortgage. You didn't pay interest on your mortgage, the bank paid you. Now, the reason the bank didn't go bust was, of course, they were actually being able to borrow money at even bigger negative interest rates than they were lending it to you. So they had a positive margin. And in that weird and wonderful world, the cost of borrowing to buy a house was below zero. Now, it wasn't below zero everywhere, but it was very close to zero. At the same time, balance sheets of households got much healthier. Now, how did they get much healthier if you had the pandemic and if jobs were lost? The answer is because governments transferred the worsening of their own finances, the bigger and bigger debts, the loss of public sector net worth to households in the form of outright economic transfers. In other words, disposable income during the pandemic didn't fall, household debts fell, the value of household assets rose, not only housing, but of course, after initial shocks, stocks and bonds and other forms of assets all increased. So when you came to the place we are now in the pandemic, in the X wave, household balance sheets have actually got much stronger than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. And that getting betterness in household balance sheets corresponds exactly to the getting worseness of public sector balance sheets. So a net transfer of assets to the household sector. So essentially those assets, which are also, by the way, held in short-term cash deposits, not only long-term investments, but short-term cash deposits, those assets are available to buy a house. The other aspect of owning the house is that the cost of borrowing to buy the house has, of course, gone down along with interest rates. So it doesn't cost anything to borrow the money. If you put those two things together, the strength of household balance sheets, the reduction in household debts, and the cost of taking out a mortgage to buy a house, you will find that the affordability index, which puts together the cost of the house and the cost of the finance to buy the house, has actually gotten a lot better throughout the world, and particularly in the United States. So in other words, affordability of housing has gone up, not down, as you would expect in a world threatened by a pandemic. What this has actually done is result, of course, in a mammoth increase in house prices. And it is general throughout the world. And it is very weird. Now, being weird, is it about to collapse? If one takes the United States, and I'm not going to deal with the 27 other economies which we monitor every day, if one just takes the United States as the biggest economy in the world, where if something happens, it's highly likely to start happening someplace else pretty fast. The US housing market is, despite my best instincts to say that this is an economic excrescence, the US housing market is unlikely to collapse. And here's a few of the reasons why. The biggest and most important reason is because when US households borrow to buy a house, they take out a mortgage which is of long duration. In other words, many maturities. Many maturities are for 10, 20, 30 years. Now let us assume for a second that the Fed is behind the curve, as I pretend, and that big government plus excessive monetary printing will result in a return of inflation. So that will push up, sooner or later, it'll push up interest rates at the short end of the curve and at the long end of the curve. And what will that do to US mortgage borrowers? It'll do practically nothing. That's the amazing thing, because the mortgages that they take out are of such long maturity for about 80% of them that no matter what happens to interest rates, their cost of mortgage does not rise. In other words, the cost of owning the house does not go up because interest rates go up. So essentially, the affordability from an interest rate perspective does not change. That means fire sales and a collapse in the housing market are far less likely in the United States. Of course, there are other countries, for example, Hong Kong, where mortgages are not fixed or not fixed for any length of time, and much of Europe is the same, who are much more vulnerable to rising interest rates and have had not exactly the same amount of increase in house prices in the United States, but big increases all the same. And those areas are more vulnerable. But if you go back in history and you think about things and how crashes happened starting in housing markets, you come to the subprime crisis, the subprime loan crisis, bond crisis in the United States. And what I'm telling you is that is unlikely to happen this time around. The crisis may happen because of sovereign debt. It may happen for a number of other reasons, geopolitical, Chinese, US Cold War, but it's probably not going to originate this time in the US housing market. That is an important fact. The other facts that drive the US housing and make it, I would say, systemically stronger is the fact that the population is still growing. The US is not like the Vatican City. It is still a growing population, not as fast as it was, and there are demographic problems, but it's still growing. So there is a demand for housing because people, as the population grows, people have to live someplace, and they like to live nice places, which goes back to the contentment economic function of housing, which is not counted in classic economics. The other thing, which is very key in owning houses in the United States, is that during the pandemic, young people in the age, youngish people, I mean younger than me, therefore they're young, people in the United States were in the house buying bracket, let's say the 25, 23-year-olds to the 45-year-olds, that area of life where people buy houses, settle down, have children, and lock themselves into that kind of future. God bless them. And those people have not been buying houses. So essentially, they have been putting off buying houses because probably they were made pretty uncertain about the economic future by the pandemic. And now those people will come back into the market. So they are a sustainable source of housing demand in the United States. Now, if you go to Italy, if you go to the older European economies, or above all, if you cross over the Pacific to Japan, where they're busy dying out, you don't have that factor pushing up systemic demand for housing or fundamental demand for housing, but you do in the United States. So to wrap it up, housing is an extraordinary economic asset. It is among the most important. It is among also the least well accounted for in classical economics. I've tried to give you a quantum economic perspective, which is much more bits and pieces and disruptive, but it probably is more realistic. I don't think the world is going to collapse because US housing is going to collapse. I think the dangers to the world economy come from the US-China Cold War. I think they come from the extreme limits of sovereign debt financed by central banks and the inefficiencies which that will introduce into economies, which will threaten both equity markets and bring back inflation and thus push up nominal and real interest rates throughout the world. Those are the real threats. But oddly enough, coming from a complete pessimist like myself, I don't think it's the US housing market which is going to actually zap your economic fortunes. So stay happy in your house. And if you like these podcasts, please subscribe below. Goodbye, good luck, and turn off the lights.